We now present the sixth and final programme in the series Heydays in Owlstocks. This week our programme centres on St Mary's Psychiatric Hospital, Castlebar.
This programme was made with the support of Sound and Vision Broadcasting Funding Scheme, a BCI initiative.
March 5th, 1866. The Castlebar District Lunatic Asylum opens its doors and gates for the first time. Before then, a building on Station Road, Castlebar, known as Madhouse Hill, was the assembly point for the insane of County Mayo. Madhouse Hill, however, went nowhere near accommodating those with psychiatric problems in the county, with many travelling to the only other asylums in the province, Ballinasloe in Galway and Sligo, to find refuge for their troubled minds. When Castlebar District Lunatic Asylum was built, it was totally surrounded by a high wall. It had access only through a gatekeeper. All doors were locked and windows were reinforced with iron bars. 132 patients arrived in Castlebar in the summer of 1866 by horse-drawn vehicles to the new asylum. It had an initial bed capacity of 250 and was complemented by 48 acres of land. Within 10 years, the asylum became severely overcrowded, so much so that 4 extensions were subsequently added in 1878, 1882, 1902 and 1936. By then, administration of the institution was in the hands of Mayo County Council by virtue of the Government of Ireland Act of 1898, and they took over the running from the governors and directors appointed by the lieutenant. By the late 1890s, the number of patients was steadily rising, and extra lands were bought from Lord Lucan in 1900 at a cost of £875. In March 1900, the number of patients had risen to 604 in the dark, cold and sparsely furnished buildings. The death rate was high, with anything from 3 to 7 patients dying monthly, mainly of typhoid and epilepsy. In a strictly segregated regime, with males on one side and females on the other, they were supervised by staff who predominantly worked 80 hours per week. Patients who were able to work did so. The men worked on the farm, the carpentry shop and the tailor shop, whilst the women passed their days in the laundry, kitchens and sewing rooms. Their reward for a day's labour consisted of tobacco, tea and extra portions of food. In 1925, the term District Lunatic Asylums was replaced to become known as District Mental Hospitals, and this was the beginning of a new dawn in both the attitudes and practices within the hospital. Formal nurse training was introduced, and by early 1950 practically all staff were qualified RMNs and more conventional therapies were introduced. However, the stream of patients entering the building was endless. On the 22nd of April 1957, 1,170 patients, made up of psychiatric, disabled and homeless, packed the wards and corridors. Despite this, improvements in the service continued. The iron bars were removed from the windows. Doors of certain wards were ordered to be left unlocked. And following the retirement of the gatekeeper in March 1957, the main gate was left open, and the name Castlebar District Mental Hospital was changed to St Mary's Hospital. For those who worked there, St Mary's Hospital was a town within a town. Behind those high walls, the patients contributed to their own way of self-sufficiency. But for residents of Castlebar, an element of curiosity existed. They wondered what was really going on behind those big high walls. Locals Jim Brett and Johnny Mee recall their childhood memories of passing by St Mary's.
This wall was 6 arches more, 8 foot, 10 foot high. But there was a line of palm trees on either side. And a certain number of patients on a Saturday, now most people were locked up, it was all keys, but a certain number of lads who worked on the farm would, without official sanction or without official permission, they would get over the wall and down, and they'd have a drink in Paddy King's pub and back up again. So 4 or 5 or 6 of us in the morning, especially on a Sunday morning, would go up, climb the wall, down the other side, and we'd go to the ball alley. And we developed friendships with some of the lads, the patients that would be there then playing handball. There'd be a small number, because most of the people were under lock and key. You see, most of the people would be from a very rural background, and they would have been there for maybe 20, 30 years. In fact, I remember years later when I was nursing, I was at one stage I was responsible in the hospital ward. If people died, it was my job to give the remains out to the undertaker, and you'd have the person's belongings. But I remember one day going through the admission documents of the patient that was now dead, and he was 60 years without ever leaving the hospital. Just think of that. Imagine 60 years locked up, and he was 18 years, and he came in from the Great War or something, having been shell-shocked.
It's a great advantage to be reared in a town where there's a psychiatric, or as was known as a mental hospital, because it does give you a very good understanding of the people that have mentally ill problems or mental health problems. And as youngsters, we went up and we played handball in the alley that was attached to it. And in fact, there was one famous handballer, Paddy Bolingbroke from Swinsford, who was an All-Ireland title holder. But it was almost a town within a town.
You wonder, why were all these people locked up? In the morning, a tractor and trailer with maybe 15 or 20 patients would go from the hospital to the farm out in Monaghan, where the airport was and is, and Travanel and all of that. And those people were brought out there like cattle, standing in an open trailer. In bad weather, they'd have a black oilskin coat on them. And you'd be looking at this, as a young fellow in town, where are these people going, And there wouldn't be anything dramatically different about them. They'd be quiet and biddable, but it looked desperate. It always struck me as a little bit like concentration camp type of thing, Another, I suppose, a landmark as a youngster then was when the circus came to town. We'd always go to the circus, but maybe 100 or 150 patients would be paraded from the hospital down Mountain View, across the Mall, across the military barracks, and into the circus. And the women all seemed to be the same. They all wore floral dresses. Sometimes, if the weather was bad, they'd have a coat. And the men always seemed to have a brown suit or a grey suit, and they all looked the same.
Self-sufficient St Mary's Hospital might have been, but Paddy Rowland, who joined the staff as an assistant storekeeper in October 1947, spent a subsequent 45 years in those same stores.
I was used to St Mary's because I too went up to the ball alley, and I got to know a lot of the patients, and they'd play handball with us. So I was kind of at home in St Mary's from the word go. But I remember going in, and I came through the dining hall, and that really surprised me, to see so many men sitting down, having their breakfast, and some of them maybe causing a little bit of trouble and more quiet and content. But to see so many people there at the one time, we had a big dining hall and there were 500 men. That really, I'd never seen that before, and it half frightened me, and the hall couldn't take the male and female patients together. It wasn't big enough. So when the males finished their breakfast, the place was cleaned, the utensils were cleaned, and the women came in. And it applied for the dinner, and it applied for the tea. Men first, women next, and so on. Everything that was needed in the hospital came through me, with the exception of medicines. I wasn't qualified to handle medicines. There's a pharmacist there, and she's full-time. But I would have to be sure at all times they had sufficient stock, especially of foodstuffs, clothing, personalised clothing and bed clothing. The chief nursing officer would call every Wednesday, and he'd want maybe 3 or 4 pounds of twist. It was a twist tobacco. It was in a roll, and you'd really think He'd get it and he'd cut it into ounces and 2 ounces, and he'd go around the wards. And I used to often say to myself, this tobacco is better for the patients than the tablets, because the patients would be so delighted to get their tobacco. Maybe it was the only comfort they had, but it made their day. The food, when I went into the hospital first, I thought it was crude. A loaf, there were a £2 loaf or a £2.5, I think £2 loaf, and it was cut into six sections. It wasn't sliced, it was cut into 6, and the staff would come to where you'd be issuing out the bread, and they'd say 48 patients, and that was 6 loaves. So you'd hand out 6 loaves that would be cut into 6, and they would take it away. But on top of each little section there'd be a small bit of butter, and that was the breakfast, with the tea. And what I thought was worst of all was the tea was in an enamel mug, or an aluminium mug. And the enamel mug, if it fell, it cracked. My boss, Willie Cameron, the Lord mercy on him, we'd always try and improve their lot. But in that respect you couldn't, because if you introduced Delph into the hospital at that time, the patients were so disturbed that you couldn't afford it. But in later years, with the advent of new drugs, we eventually got the cups and saucers into the hospital. And I remember the first day there was a trolley overturned, and the cups and saucers all over the place. I said, this isn't going to last, but it did.
Jim Brett joined St Mary's Hospital in 1959, initially as a painter, but by 1965 he had qualified as a nurse. The job as a nurse had its rewards, but also its challenges.
One of the most demoralising, and I will never forget it, I'll never consider it other than demoralising, both for the individual patient and for myself or the nurse there. As the junior nurse, my job at bathing would be to put stuff called Defesto, which prevented any sort of infestation of lice. And I'll put it this way to you, anywhere there was hair, you applied Defesto. And that meant the patient walked up to you, you stood in the door out to the corridor, and you had a bowl of Defesto and a swab, and anywhere, the pubic hair, underarm hair, top of the head. I found that pathetic. I thought it was the most desperate denial of human rights. And that's what it was at that stage. And you can imagine a lad from farming background in Belmullet or Achill or anywhere coming into this with the privacy of his home life and having be subjected to this, desperate indignity. I felt it was desperate. It was one of the things that really I could not take. One of the particular things was the loss of identity for the individual. Nobody owned their suit of clothes. I could have your trousers today, it would go to the laundry, and you could have it tomorrow, and I might have your jacket. The same thing applied to underclothing. And another thing that really bugged me was the communal bathing. Now that really to me smacked of Auschwitz and places like this, where you had a whole division, all the patients from your ward were confined on a corridor. Halfway down that corridor there was a big bathroom, and every patient was stripped naked there, stripped himself, walked into the big bathroom, which were all showers, and you had massive bodies, and they came out and they got the change of clothes outside, the shirt and the underwear and the pants and the jacket or whatever, but it wouldn't be their own.
The farmyard was a hive of activity in St Mary's. Matt Shaw arrived in Castlebar in 1965 to take over running the farm.
To give you an idea of the size of the hospital when I went there there must have been around 1,100 patients there, and there was a set amount of food to be given to each patient each day, to standard regulations from the Department of Health. And it took 1,500 worth of potatoes to do a dinner there on them regulations, and about 600 worth of carrots, if there was carrots on the day, or maybe 300 heads of cabbage. We had a farmyard and a butcher's and a piggery. We used to supply the beef and the mutton to the county hospital and county home. So we killed 4 cattle every week, 30 sheep and 4 pigs. The pigs were provided on the farm. We had 12 or 14 sows. The idea of the farms, I suppose the first farm that was bought to build a hospital on. And then they set up pathways or little roads through the farm for patients out exercising. And they were maintained by using the cinders out of the boiler house by a patient with an ass and cart. And he kept all the holes filled and kept the avenues in order. And patients used to go out, both male and female, for long walks through the farm. There was a garden attached, there was a gardener, and a lot of the vegetables were produced in there at that time. But when they bought the Monian farm, then they extended the tillage out there, and they had more potatoes and more vegetables. There was a famous cow herd in the mental hospital. It was set up by John Downes, and possibly his father, who was land steward before I came in 1965. And the building was on the townland of Knockafunta, so that's exactly what they called the herd. It was registered under the name of Knockafunta, and all the cows would have had a name, Knockafunta Lizzie and Knockafunta Bess, and the bulls had appropriate names as well that we sold. We sold a lot of bull calves to farmers in Mayo that needed a stock bull. That continued on until the county hospital was extended, and the first thing on the farm to suffer was the pig herd and the slaughterhouse. Both of them were in right beside where the maternity unit was opened up, and they had to give way, and we sold all the pigs off, and we had to start slaughtering our livestock down the town. Then when the health board took over, the county council held a special meeting, and they passed over all the property to the health board, the Knockafunta farm and the Knockcrockery farm, but they held the Monian farm for industry, and within a couple of years we were out of that, for the simple reason that Baxter came to us. Baxter came in about the 8th of August 1971. John Paul, the contractor, pulled in, and we had to get out the farm and get out the sheds, those sheds there, farm sheds. And that was the beginning of the end of the mental hospital farm as we knew it in Mayo.
One of the things that struck me was the tremendous value in therapy to the people who worked on the farms. This must have been unknown, because these kind of therapy methods of the 19th century, they didn't realise what occupational therapy was. But as the century wore on, they must have realised we are curing people through just letting them go out and work on the land, work with things that they knew about, coming from the rural background that they did.
As areas of nursing improved, 2 nurses were granted 2-year leave of absence to do general nurse training in England. One of those was Willie McNamee.
Well, I went in there in the mid-1950s, and really the place hadn't changed much, I would think, even though I wasn't there in 1866. I don't think it had changed much in the intervening 100 years, you know. The first impression you got was that it was a high security area, because every door you went to, by and large, was locked. And to get into the main corridor of the hospital, you had to pass through 3 sets of doors, each of which was locked. And when you became a staff member, you were issued the keys so that you could, it would facilitate your movement through the doors. But it was impressed on you that security was all important. And if patients were being brought anywhere or going to meals or leaving the daycare area to go to a dining hall and so on, it was impressed upon you that you made sure you had the same number coming back that you had going to, whatever it was you had to go to. So you got this impression of a building that was very secure, had an awful lot of people in it, quite an amount of noise and talk and so on, even though when you looked to see who was talking to whom, very often you didn't see many people talking to any other person, but they'd be mumbling away to themselves maybe, or possibly having a conversation with some imaginary person, something like that, which can happen. And I suppose we all talk to ourselves somewhere or other,
Around the town of Castlebar, people had a fascination with Ward 9. But what was it?
Ward 9 was simply an admission ward for people who were involuntarily admitted and would strive to get out, who wouldn't be contained. So it was really a locked ward with a higher concentration of staff. But people didn't spend long in Ward 9. They moved on after the acute phase of their illness, where they settled. Generally about 2 to 3 weeks people were moving on, and depending then on what their prognosis, the outlook was, they would be going to one of what we call the back wards, the long stay wards, and they might be there for years, or they might be there for a year, or they would go on to a Ward 16, which nobody ever hears about. So everybody hears about Ward 9. Ward 16 was the place people went home from, which is a great ward, and you went home from there. But now some people remained in Ward 16 for years, and it was the same on the female side. You had a Ward 13 and a Ward 15. Ward 4 on the male side was the hospital ward. I worked in it for several years. Ward 8 on the female side was the hospital ward. That's where the ECT was done, where the bed nursing was done, where the stitching was done in the event of accidents or all of that sort of stuff, and where voluntary patients were admitted to, because it was an open ward, no locked doors.
With well over 1,000 patients in St Mary's Hospital at any given time, it brought together an array of characters and personalities. Some of their experiences were happy, but in general, the light at the end of the tunnel was quite dim.
There was a minority of patients here who shouldn't have been here. They were in for social reasons. Some of them may just have had babies out of wedlock, and that would warranted to be put into hospital. And then when they get in here, they get institutionalised. Some develop the habits of patients who are very disturbed, and then just to get on the circle, and that's it.
We got to know them very well on the farm. There'd be 30 or 40 patients working on the farm. Some of them working actually out in Moynion. They were brought out each morning and they had their dinner out there. More of them worked on the grounds, maintaining the grounds. We done up the grounds in the 60s, and there was lawnmowers bought, but there was some terrific men with skills. There was great men for the bog, for the slaying. There was one particular man, he was a wonderful man to build a rick of oats, which was a skilled job at the time. There was a couple of men able to sharpen aside, something I could never do myself, and they could cut the lawns in front of the hospital, and you would think it was a lawnmower that had done it. Two brothers, and they were very, very skilled men. They'd have the pipe in the mouth and 2 or 3 rubs on the blade, and he'd have it singing through the grass. Now there was 2 brothers that way, and they were excellent men. As I said, there was a lot of very good workers, but these were skilled men. They learned it at home as young lads before they came into the mental hospital, but they were great men to have. There was a couple of good livestock men. There was one particular man, and I suppose he kept the farm going from a livestock point of view. He wouldn't go to bed at night if there was a cow calving. An animal sick, he wouldn't go to bed. They'd ring here to tell me that a certain gentleman wasn't in his bed, and I'd have to go and find him at night. But he was a wonderful character, lovely man. He was in it for nearly 40 years in the hospital. And he died feeding cows, and that's the way he'd have wanted it.
Reading through the records, and I have a chapter called Patients' Lives, I was emotional at times reading about some of the tragic incidents. and tragic situations. I think I've mentioned one or two. I've told the stories of some people changing the names here and there. The sadness of their lives, the incidents that brought them inside St. Mary's and which never allowed them to leave again. These were tragic moments for people for all kinds of different reasons. Quite often the society in which they lived was a conspiring society, a society which, if you weren't 100%, well, tough luck, you were into St. Mary's. And, there were all kinds of issues like land and land ownership and acquiring pieces of land by having a member of the family declared insane. I mean, there were lots of instances like that in the background. And then, of course, there was the stories within the hospital itself. I think I instanced one particular character there who, when the roll call was being taken at night, had disappeared, one patient. And he was found the next morning in a ditch holding a young calf who had slipped into a muddy ditch out in Drumconnellan on part of the farm. And he stayed there all night to keep the cow's head above water so that it wouldn't drown. And he's supposed to be insane? There were instances, things like that. Then, of course, there were little stories told to me by psychiatric nurses. One man who met a patient in Liverpool. And he said, I thought he was still an inmate. Now, the guy had just absconded and gone and lived his own life elsewhere. There was nothing wrong with him. So, a lot of the people who were inside weren't really as bad as might be expected.
One of them, when I mentioned earlier about the ass and cart, he kept the roads if there was a load of sand dumped for a building purpose, he'd be there with the donkey and cart to take a bit of it for some of the roads. But he took the cinders out of the boiler house every day and brought them out and shoveled them into holes in the avenues and kept them. And he was there long before I went there, and he was there up till he was 88. He lost his sight, and the donkey got that old that we had to get rid of him. He was just unfixable, and we had to get rid of him, and there was a lot of woe over that, unfortunately. And he got out a barrow, and he done it with a barrow. He didn't give up.
Maggie May, the story of that girl from North Mayo, she's a compendium of characters, and her story was that goes back to just before the First World War, and her brother had planned to go to America, and he would send home money and she might follow and go and work in service in Boston or somewhere, and the family would kind of get by. And the parents were getting a little bit old, and the brother, by way of going to America, went off in the First World War and was killed. Another brother was very angry about this, and of course he joined the Republican movement and took part in the War of Independence, but was tragically killed when a bomb exploded. Now this left Maggie, our parents died, just heartbroken, and this left her at home. And of course what had happened to her was the ins and outs. The house was a Republican house, there were ins and outs, people coming and going, and suddenly this innocent girl was pregnant. And she had no family, so put her in. She was depressed, so she was sent to St. Mary's. God knows what happened to the land. Did she sign it away before? What happened? Nobody knows. But she ends up in St. Mary's. The child is born, it's taken for adoption, and she spends the rest of her life there until she dies of TB. These are the sad stories. I mean, these are not the stories of a fella getting a few thumps down in the corridor somewhere for misbehaving. These are the real tragic, lives of quiet desperation.
Getting to speak to patients themselves was difficult. Speaking about your own mental illness in public takes courage. But Jim, who suffers from schizophrenia and who was a patient in St. Mary's on a number of occasions, did give us an insight into his illness.
I'd say it probably had been coming on through my teenage years and in school and that, it's in secondary school. Just to touch on that a little bit, maybe in secondary school, the first few years are fine, are grand, I had a good time, but after that, after second and the third year, things, I got some difficulties with concentration a bit and that, and I suppose fell behind a bit in a way, really, that way. I didn't know anything about mental illness, or had I ever heard about it, let alone know anything about it, and I actually then, in later years after leaving school, I slipped a disc and I was in Merlin Park for quite a while, like, and that's where I actually had my first breakdown, was in Merlin Park Hospital, and just since then I have been in the services as it were, you know. Hard to describe. When you get kind of palpitations and panic attacks, and you know, with the illness symptoms, you have maybe hallucinations, that sort of thing, you know, and delusions and that type of thing. Well, the first thing was door locked, key gone out the door locked, and not able to buy, maybe pop out for a Mars bar or maybe cigarettes. You'd be lucky to have a few cigarettes, you know. And in those years, not sure about them, but at different times during the illness, your social welfare will be stopped when you go into a hospital, you know. And you know, if you smoked, which I did, quite a heavy smoker over the years. I'm off now 5 years actually, but you wouldn't get a whole lot in the way of visitors now or anything like that in to see or anything like that, you know. But just another feature of the times, I suppose, you know. Get up and have the breakfast and play pool, watch TV, maybe, that type of thing, you know. There was no sense to it really from start to finish, bar for your own sake. I suppose you're in a controlled or a safe environment, you wouldn't harm yourself or stuff maybe like that. But there was no therapy of any kind. You got your tablets, you had your meals, you went to bed, you slept, you got up, and that was it. Like, you know, there was nothing compared to today's standards. Again, I have to say that. But I can just say, like, as I see things in the last, say, 20 years now, or that with the some new medications have come on the market and stuff, and the one I'm on in particular is very, very helpful. And I'd say it and the third group and one-to-one therapy, those work very well. And when that works, then it led me on to a job. Like, I don't have some terrible symptoms like I used to have.
The 50s saw a massive change in medical mindset. The variety and impact of new drugs on the market was the start of a drastic improvement within mental health, and was the most significant factor in where the services now find themselves today. John Connolly, a consultant psychiatrist and RMS at St Mary's from 1986 following the retirement of Dr Gilvary, and Dr Patricia Noon, clinical director of Mayo Mental Health Services, have no doubt about the importance that modern medicines have made in patient recovery over the last 50 years.
The introduction of these medications certainly brought about a great reduction in the worst symptoms of psychiatric illness, and changed the patient career as it was in many ways. And a lot of people who had been long-term in hospital were able to be discharged back to their homes and their communities where they had such communities, because not all of them did. I mean, that is the very sad thing about a lot of the psychiatric patients in institutions, is they've lost contact with their communities. And we can show you people who've been there for 50 or 60, who had been there for 50 or 60 years, who'd never had a visitor. But to go back to your question, so the drugs, when they were first introduced, brought about a sea change in thinking, and opened up hope and expectation of a better life for many people. And gradually, of course, people learned that psychiatric patients could very well be dealt with and live in the community, and that brings on then the whole idea of community care. Community care is great, and that means that you try to treat people in their homes and in their communities and avoid institutionalisation and the problems that brings, and there are many. But unfortunately, what was a very good idea became kind of warped and became to be seen by many administrative bodies as a way of saving money. So in many countries, but fortunately not in Mayo, there was a huge rush to close down institutions. And what happened was people were dumped into the the community with no backup and very, very few resources, and left largely to their own devices, and that put them in a worse place than they had been. We had the old idea about people who were incarcerated in psychiatric hospitals, which were, as it were, human warehouses. And I was saying they were out of sight, out of mind. But of course, a lot of people who were wrongly discharged into the community en masse were equally well out of sight and couldn't really be identified, and therefore their isolation and suffering was perhaps even greater.
It was the arrival of the antipsychotic medication and the antidepressants. That's what changed everything. I mean, if we didn't have the medication, then we would never have been able to get the patients out. A lot of them were, of course, dependent on the institution, and some of them would have been stable but dependent on the institution. But family circumstances as well would have interfered with people's capacity to take them home. And of course, what you have to remember is that the patients never wanted to leave the hospital. Very few of the patients who had been there for a lengthy time wanted to leave. It was their home. And they were institutionalized, and they were well looked after. I mean, they were dry, they were warm, they were provided with clothing, they had excellent food, and they had somebody. I mean, if you had somebody every day asking, "How are you today? How do you feel?" It's nice.
The level of education as regards psychotropic medications, which were the medications developed to treat mental illness, they didn't become available until largactyl chlorpromazine was developed in the 1960s. Up to that, it was custodial care. People were locked up. If necessary, they were confined in a cell. They may have to be in a cell for a week or a day or whatever. With the advent of the psychotropic medicines, it changed. And then there were greater developments where, obviously it's like bringing the horse to the water. You can give the man a box of tablets, but if he doesn't take them, it's no good. So to overcome that, and the reason people wouldn't take them was because of the lack of insight. They didn't feel there was anything wrong, so why should I take tablets if there's nothing wrong with me? So how that was got over was some of the pharmaceutical companies developed long-acting medications which were given by injection. They were known as depot preparations, and there are at least 6 or 7 of those now. We were using those with great effect. People were locked up because they were violent and because they couldn't be treated. Now, with the advent of change and more enlightened thinking, it has all moved on, so that now we no longer have St. Mary's. The building is no longer a psychiatric hospital. There is no patient in there now. So what you have now is a medium stay unit in the old St. Teresa's unit, and you have an acute admission unit within the walls of Mayo General Hospital. Just another ward, which is as it should be.
By 1970, the need for the development of a community service was well recognised. It was decided to appoint 4 community psychiatric nurses to work full-time in the community. The late Bridie Corley, Maeve Duffy, PJ Mangan and Jim Brett took up the duties in the community towards the end of 1970.
Another thing, I suppose, that moved me to look at the possibilities of outside ways of dealing with psychiatric problems was the thing I mentioned earlier, a man coming from wherever, roped and handcuffed. And he was taken out of a car there with 3 or 4 guards into the front hall. The ropes and the handcuffs had to come off. And 99 times out of 100, that was it. There was no more violence. There was nothing. And then the man was taken in, he was admitted. And you would see this terribly upset man coming in, and after a couple of weeks, a couple of months, if he was lucky, he would be discharged. And he would be progressed from this ward to that ward and then home. The same man would appear again in the same situation with the ropes and the handcuffs and the guardy again, maybe in 6 months or a year. And I used to say to myself, what happened in the interval since this man left here well until he comes back again in the same situation? And I used to figure, well, medication was the same. He was prescribed the same medication outside as he was getting inside. So I figured that he probably wasn't taking the medication or wasn't getting it. And I felt if there was somebody out there to provide the care and the service, you would obviate the need for readmissions, and certainly this sort of melodramatic readmissions. So finally in 1971 the opportunity arose, and they decided in their wisdom that they would set up a community psychiatric nursing service.
Well, home-based treatment is now, at the moment, we're trying to develop that, where we will even actually be treating people in their home. We'll be sending staff out to treat them in their home and support them in their home. We're doing that on a limited scale at the moment. We hope to develop that. And with the new medications coming on stream, that will support them as well. But the big thing is that once you're in employment and you get for a better word, a breakdown, or that mental illness starts to affect you, our big aim is to keep you in employment, keep you in your community, keep you going as long as we can keep you going, because that is, to keep you in the community is where you will get your cure and where you will get your recovery. But coming into an institution and will not help you in your recovery, and we'll try to keep you with your friends, with your family, with your work colleagues, and keep you there.
I'm very proud of the facilities we have been able to provide in the community, like even here in Claremorris, in Swinford, in Westport, in Castlebar, Ballina, different places. We have some fine buildings, fine services, day centres and so on. And I think you saw the old St. Teresa's unit yourself, which is beautifully restored for the people who were in St. Mary's. And I think it was terrific to see them move out of the old building, which was no longer suitable and hadn't been for many years, and to see them move into much more suitable, appropriate and humane buildings where they have a much more intimate kind of habitation, if you like, you know.
Whilst most of the attention on the outside centred on patients, those with the responsibility of caring for those most vulnerable people were the staff. Piers Finnegan, the current Director of Nursing for Mayo Mental Health Services, tells us more.
Well, there was very little hope for them, because in the 40s when they came in here there was very little medication, there was very little therapeutic interventions. When people came in here, basically they were in for life. If it was more luck to get out than from a therapeutic perspective. And for staff dealing with that. And you must remember that staff who worked here in that time in the 40s and earlier than that were in here as attendants. There was very little training. The training was on site. It was only in the 50s when psychiatric nursing training really took off in this country. At times the mental illness can get out of hand and they can become very disturbed, but the staff would cope in that. They had their own coping mechanisms earlier on. Now they're trained and educated on how to deal with that. But again, when you talk to members of staff who retired, and I've talked to staff who retired in the last 10 years who were here in that period, and they will talk about some of the dangers that they face coming in here at night duty with very little staff, and some of the dangers that are associated with people being brought in by the guards in handcuffs, and then once the handcuffs were taken off, they didn't know what they were going to expect. But they learned to cope, and they were very, very, very good people. The one big thing that I noticed, and I did a lot of my training in Dublin, was when I came to the west of Ireland, that the staff looked on the patients as their neighbour, their brother and sister, because that's who they were. They were very, very close. I would say if a patient was admitted here, there was some staff member here who knew them outside the hospital.
Mayo Mental Health Services have come the full circle. Emphasis is now on community welfare where possible, and although the subject remains a taboo, things are improving. St. Mary's Hospital closed its doors in 2005. If its walls could speak, one wonders what they would say.
Well, I wonder. I'd love to be able to interview them and to get their views, but I think they would tell us tales of a lot of human suffering and misery, and a lot of good work as well that went on in institutions like St. Mary's, where, given the times that were in it, people were treated probably as humanely as was possible. By today's standards, of course, that would be not acceptable at all, but we have to see everything in its time and in its context.
A hospital is a lonely place, as anybody knows. When you're separated from your loved ones, and especially if you don't really know why you're separated from them, which would be the case with a lot of those people in times gone by, the effect is magnified, and they'd be lonely, and time would be long, and especially if they didn't have things for doing, they would, have something to occupy their time. It in itself would in actual fact make their condition worse,
they were telling us that they had a tremendous and very varied experience, and that the people who came within the walls had tremendous creativity and great range of emotion, and that they had a wonderful, rich fantasy life, and that they also suffered a great deal. That there was great sadness and loneliness and unhappiness, and I expect anger and hope and a full range of emotions. It would be one of the most emotional settings one could ever come across, I expect.
On balance, given the numbers who went through the institution, there were a hell of a lot more nice things happened than not nice things. Now, of course, people don't record the bad things, so you can't write about it from my perspective as a historian. I can't tell that story unless it happens. I can only imagine. If the walls could speak, I think it would come in the form of a literary kind of reminiscence of a patient, or maybe someone could take and read between the lines of all those lives, the tragedy of their lives, and tell the story of individual lives within the mental institution. I think that would be slightly different from my hard-bitten factual history.
There was a very old doctor that I worked with, Tom Murphy. He was a genius, a lovely, lovely old man. And he had one motto, which he gave to me, and I always applied it and lived by it. And it was this: life is mostly froth and bubble. Two things stand like stone: kindness in another's trouble, and courage in your own. Now, it's fairly profound when you sit down and figure it, but if you could apply that to your work, you won't be far wrong.
I'd like to see a day when mental health will be talked about at the church gate or in the pub or whatever, you know. And I think that'll happen and will come, but probably be quite a long time maybe away or that. But it's very much, even still today, quite a taboo subject, you know.
They had some great sayings. I heard one old boy one night. They were talking about a certain person that had died in the county, and somebody said, well, he's left it all behind him now, he's a wealthy man. And the patient said, no, he didn't leave it behind him, he was taken from it. One old guy used to have a saying, we all know that your shoe is hurting, but only yourself knows which part of it. And that's very true to life. It's little things like that you remember about certain people. I learned a lot.
This programme on St Mary's Hospital, Castlebar was produced by Ronan Courell and Tommy Marren. The producers would like to thank the following contributors: Dr Patricia Noon, Jim Brett, Joe McDermott, Paddy Rowland, Matt Shaw, Piers Finnegan, Willie McNamee, Dr John Connolly and Johnny Mee. A special thank you to Jim for speaking about his illness.
This programme was made with the support of Sound and Vision, Broadcasting Funding Scheme, a BCI initiative.